This is hands down the smallest RTX A2000 powered mini PC that you can put together right now. It's coming in at 1 liter and you can run AAA games on this thing all day long. What's going on, everybody? It's etaprime back here again. Today we're going to be turning this unassuming Lenovo mini PC into a full-fledged gaming machine. This is the Lenovo ThinkCentre M920Q. They do make a couple different variants, but the one I have here has the i7-8700T, so we've got 6 cores and 12 threads. Now, we could game on the UHD graphics, but it's really not going to do us any good for newer AAA games. So we need something with a bit more power, and for this, I opted to use the Nvidia RTX A2000. This is actually a modified version. I've taken the low-profile dual slot and turned it into a single-slot low-profile card using Nerdware's low-profile A2000 cooler. So it's a third-party company making these coolers here. The one I have is actually the version 1, but if you take a look on their website right now, version 2 is up for pre-order. Hopefully I can get my hands on it. But they also make a low-profile cooler for the A4000, which would give us a giant jump in performance. But I don't have an A4000 because the price on those is way up there right now. But either way, I think the RTX A2000 is going to offer plenty of power for a small form factor gaming PC like this. We're basically going to be able to play anything at 1080p with this one. As you can see, pulling the top off that M920Q doesn't leave us much room to work with inside. But luckily, Lenovo did include a PCIe slot. It's proprietary right now, and you will need an adapter. These are about $15 over on eBay, but it takes it up to an X16 slot. And it really only runs at PCIe X8 3.0, but it's plenty for the A2000 or even like an RTX 3050. Most single slot cards are going to fit right inside of here. Something like that RX 6400 low profile single slot works great in this. I've done a little bit of testing with it. But again, going over to that RTX A2000 is going to offer us much better performance. There is one little thing we need to remove around back in order to get this in. Just 2 screws there. You can remove it very easily. Now we'll go ahead and grab our GPU of choice, use the PCIe adapter, and slot the card right down inside of this mini PC. With this low-profile cooler for the RTX A2000, the cover for the Lenovo does fit, but then we need to worry about cooling. So modifying this cover, maybe cutting a hole here or even a larger hole system, would definitely be the way to go. Right now I'm actually in the process of moving, so I've got all of my tools at my other place. In this video I'm going to be running this with the cover off, but there's several people online that have modified these, either cutting a hole to match up with the GPU intake or the CPU intake, or use a 3D printed cover. It would be pretty simple if I had my Dremel or even a step bit just to get a hole there big enough to draw air in and pull it through the whole chassis with that GPU. If you buy one of these online and it comes with a power supply, more than likely it's going to come with a 65-watt power supply. And just for the CPU itself, that's going to be more than enough. But we've got this GPU that can pull up to close to 80 watts. CPU here up to 65, but sustained across the board, 35 to 40. So that 65-watt power supply just isn't going to cut it. Luckily, Lenovo does offer several different wattages. You could go with a 160 and it'd be fine for a system like this. I just had a 230 laying around, so I figured we'd use it with this system. Another thing to think about is RAM and storage, and on the bottom we've got another cover. We can add an M.2 SSD and dual channel SODIMM DDR4 RAM. I've got 16 gigs in here. It'll run it up to 2666 with the M920Q. And when it comes to storage, I'm going to be using a 2 terabyte M.2 SSD. With this low profile RTX A2000, we're still working with a 1 liter form factor, so it's an ultra small form factor PC. But now we can play AAA games on this thing. Alright, so let's go ahead and start it up. Got our power button up front. CPU fan and GPU fan is spinning up. And like I mentioned, I'm going to be running Windows 11 Pro. So obviously from that RTX A2000, we've got HDMI going up to the monitor itself. I have pre-installed some drivers here, so it should boot right into Windows and start working right off the bat. But there are a few software tweaks that I want to go over just so we can get the maximum performance out of this mini PC. Before we get into testing, there are a few things that I wanted to go over here. There's a few settings that I needed to change in order to get the best performance out of this thing. As you can see, we've got the i7-8700T, 16 gigs of RAM, and of course we've got that Nvidia RTX A2000 with the low profile cooler installed. With this small form factor Lenovo and that 8700T, Once we install a GPU and put a load on that GPU over that PCIe slot, it's going to limit the CPU power. So in order to take this up, I use throttle stop, and I've actually managed to get this up to around 40 watts sustain while gaming. So it's about 5 watts more than we've seen in the past. Usually it takes that CPU down around 35 watts, but I'll show you exactly what I've done here. From throttle stop, high performance mode is enabled, speed shift EPP is enabled. We need to disable this right here. It has to be disabled in order for us to get the maximum or as much as we can over to the CPU and the GPU at the same time. Speed step and C1E is also enabled. From TPL, this will allow us to adjust the TDP. Now I've got mine set to 45 watts, but it won't quite get there when we're putting a load on that GPU. Sync is enabled. I've clamped the long power PL1 profile here to 45 watts, and that's about it. So I'll show you real quick. Over here, we've got core temp, power. This is going to be our wattage. I know it's a bit hard to see, but when I run a stress test, you'll see this jump up to 45. But as soon as I put a load on that GPU, this is going to come down to around 40. So 38 to 41 I've seen while gaming. Not a ton of wattage, but for the 6-core, 12-thread CPU, it's doing pretty decently. Now, if we were to use a much larger PC, we could definitely get more out of this. And most of the time, if you went with a small form factor or a mini tower, you get the i7-8700 non-T variant. So last thing here, with the low profile A2000, since we're using a totally new heatsink and, cooling solution for that unit, I do have to adjust the fan speed here. Now, even at 100%, it's not super loud in this PC, but what I've been doing is going up to around 75, and it does seem to kind of keep it from thermal throttling with the cover off, or if you were to modify the case on this thing. So I've set this, fan's going to spin up just a bit more, and now the first thing I wanted to show off were some benchmarks that I ran on this thing, and then we're going to get right into some gaming because it's pretty impressive what this will do. Checking out some GPU benchmarks with 3D Mark, Night Raid coming in with a 32,440, and I also ran Time Spy. We got a pretty impressive 6,264. I mean, given the form factor here, this is a pretty impressive score. But these are synthetic benchmarks, and now it's time to get into some real-world gaming. First one on the list here is Black Myth WUKONG, just using the built-in benchmark, 1080p, medium with DLSS set to 70%, got an average of 62. It's definitely a harder game to run, so I'd probably take a few of those settings down to low. Next on the list, Red Dead 2 1080 high with DLSS set to balance, and we could go through, tweak those settings, take it up just a bit more because with it set up like this, we saw an average of 81 FPS. And if you take a look at Afterburner up in the top left-hand corner, our CPU is getting close to that 40 watt TDP. Like I mentioned, this is usually around 35 up to around 40. And the RTX A2000 is pulling close to 70 watts. Forza Horizon 5, 1080, high settings, no DLSS. This is one that I knew was going to perform great. And I've tested this on the A2000 at 1440 in the past. We can get an average of around 72 FPS with no DLSS. High settings, 1440p. I had a weird issue with Overwatch 2. Now initially loading into this stage here before anybody else was on screen, it was slowing down on me quite a bit. I noticed that the CPU did kind of max up to around 80%, so I think we may have been a bit CPU bound with this game and that lower end i7-8700T. But after about a minute, everything cleared up and we're seeing a really nice frame rate here. Ratchet and Clank, Rift Apart, 1080 medium DLSS set to balance. Didn't need any of that FSR frame gen. We could use it here with these newer Nixus games. It's there, so if you wanted to get over 100 with it at medium or take it up to around the same at high settings, you could always enable that. And keep in mind, it'll work with the DLSS scaler also. I wanted to throw OG Skyrim in, so here it is at 1440p ultra high, and I knew we weren't going to have an issue with this. It's just one of my favorite games. Wanted to make sure we'd be good at 1440p with it. So yeah, with the older games, you could definitely take them up 1440, and even some of the older stuff than this will run at 4K on the A2000. We're at a high medium mix. This is something I had to go through, just kind of adjust a few settings here and there. 1080 with DLSS set to balanced. Now you could always take DLSS to performance if you want to, but personally I think balanced does look pretty good here. I mean, it is a bit noticeable with DLSS. Either way, at 1080 high medium mix, we're seeing an average of around 92 FPS. And the final game I wanted to test here was Starfield, and initially I went into this at 1080 medium with DLSS. I tried balance and performance. It wasn't a great experience at 1080. So what I had to do was enable FSR frame gen, and now we're over that 60 mark, but I completely understand there's people out there that don't like frame gen. But when you're working with a low spec system, all of those technologies added together can really help out the end experience. So going into this, I really wasn't sure what to expect, but so far, really impressed given the form factor here. Coming in at 1 liter, we've got that RTX A2000, i7, 6 cores, 12 threads, albeit it is an older 8th gen Intel. But with this thing only running up to around 40 watts in this, I think it's performing absolutely amazing for what we have. I need to modify this chassis, and I will have at least one more video coming up. I do want to do some overclocking with the A2000, maybe get the wattage up on this CPU if the temps will allow me with a modified cooling system. So if you're interested in seeing a video like that, make sure you hit that like button and think about subscribing so you don't miss the next one. And if you want to put something like this together, I will leave links for everything I used in this build down below in the description. But that's going to wrap it up for this video. If you've got any questions or you want to see anything else running on this machine in the next video, let me know in the comments. Like always, thanks for watching.